A conveyor belt of wealth, WA's mining boom continues to deliver rivers of gold, which are at the heart of a new row over whether the state is getting more than its fair share of GST revenue.
These East Coast clowns simply do not understand Western Australia. They have no Western Australian representative and no idea.
On Friday, WA's Premier was quick to besmirch the Productivity Commission's report into a 2018 GST deal, which the independent body slammed as a costly mistake that should be scrapped, winning support from other states.
Western Australia is so wealthy and so rich that they're competing and bidding on New South Wales rugby league games and putting tens of millions of dollars on the table. That's how rich they are.
We can't have a distribution system that only makes one state better off. That's not fair. Every one of these recommendations makes Australia fairer.
According to the Commission, the deal struck by then Treasurer Scott Morrison and subsequently embraced by Anthony Albanese cost the federal budget $23 billion in its first 6 years, $22 billion of which flowed to the West.
I assure Western Australians of this, you will get your fair share because your work and what you contribute to the national economy really counts.
A political pledge from the Prime Minister the West is eager to take as gospel.
The Prime Minister told me the arrangements in place for Western Australia will remain.
Anthony Albanese, who backtracked on negative gearing, who backtracked on capital gains tax, how can any West Australian trust that he is not going to backtrack on what is right for West Australians?
Western Australia started complaining about the distribution of GST revenues in the early 2000s when they were, to paraphrase Paul Keating, kissed on the nether regions by a Chinese rainbow, and started to become richer than the rest of Australia by a bigger margin than any other state had ever been.
At the heart of this row is a complex system of how GST gets split among states and territories. Rather than an even share based on population, the money is doled out according to need, the principle of horizontal fiscal equalisation. But as the iron ore boom generated a flood of royalties for WA, its relative share of the GST collapsed, prompting the previous coalition government to impose a floor and a no worse off guarantee that requires top-ups from general federal tax revenues.
The reason why the reformed GST distribution arrangements cost more than anticipated back in 2018 is because the price of iron ore remained stronger for much longer than anticipated.
The politics is less complex. The state's voters helped Malcolm Turnbull narrowly retain government in 2016 and Scott Morrison in 2019. Anthony Albanese won a slim majority in the 2022 election after picking up 4 WA seats. Thanks to Labor's thumping majority in last year's election, advocates for reform say now is the time to challenge WA's political hold on the GST carve-up.
Since the 2025 election, Western Australia no longer has the National Parliament over a barrel, and I would like to think that both sides of politics would now put the national interest in ensuring that no matter where you live, Australians have access to similar standards of education, healthcare, policing, environmental protection and the like, whilst paying similar state taxes.
Economist Saul Eslake has long campaigned against a deal that he calls the worst public policy decision of the 21st century thus far.
Western Australians want the rest of the country to pretend that the windfall gains they've reaped over the last 20 years don't exist.
WA defends its share of the carve-up because it represents the engine room of the national economy and needs the money to support the mining industry. But Saul Eslake argues that labour productivity in WA has fallen since 2018, while there's been growth in almost every other jurisdiction.
The arguments that Western Australia keeps putting, that this corruption of the GST distribution system is somehow essential to ensure Australia's overall national prosperity, just doesn't bear comparison with the facts.
Despite the changed political backdrop, one Albanese government source told 7:30 it was hard to see them doing anything to renege on promises to the West. but there may be appetite to look at what the Productivity Commission described as the perverse outcomes of the current system. For instance, if there's a natural disaster in New South Wales, which acts as the benchmark for the carve-up formula, WA's GST share would rise.
That's quite perverse and contrary to the intention of the legislation in 2018.
The Productivity Commission will finalise its report into the GST distribution by the end of the year, and it's fair to say WA is not expecting a friendly outcome.
I read through the document. You know, it references Salt East Lake more than it references WA. I mean, it's just, to be honest, it's a very biased political document.
I take her remarks in a sense as a sort of backhanded compliment, although she obviously didn't mean it that way. If I had written the report, I would have subtitled it Educating Rita.
Despite the potshots, the Productivity Commission report has fired up a high-stakes political debate about how governments fund the services that voters demand.
I would like to think that a Labor government that professes a belief in equity, as it did in its most recent federal budget, and which wants to be seen as a prudent manager of the federal budget, would put those considerations ahead of buying votes from Australia's richest state